I'm Jeff McCrease. I'm the Deputy Director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and it's a great privilege to welcome yet another distinguished scholar here to Annapolis. Dr. Francis Fukuyama is the Oliver Nomalini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and a faculty member of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's also the director of Stanford's Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy and a professor by courtesy of political science. Dr. Fukuyama has written widely on issues of development and international politics. His 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, has appeared in over 20 foreign translations. His latest book is entitled Liberalism and Its Discontents. Francis Fukuyama received his BA from Cornell University in classics and a PhD from Harvard in political science. So it's a great honor to welcome here to Annapolis Professor Francis Fukuyama.
I guess it's appropriate that I'm rising in defense of liberalism after Patrick Deneen. Is Patrick still here? Oh, yeah, there he is. Okay. Well, it'll be an interesting counterpoint. So, I consider I had a little motorcycle accident on Tuesday, and I'm still feeling a little bit of the effects of that. So if I stop and grimace a little bit, you'll understand why. In any event, I consider myself a classical liberal. It's an important adjective, putting classical in front of liberal, because I think that there's been an evolution of liberalism in certain directions that are not necessarily implied in classical liberalism, and I think that most of the complaints about liberalism actually have to do with those extensions of liberalism rather than the core doctrine. So let me just begin with a definition of what I regard as liberalism. Liberals believe in the universal equality of human dignity. That is to say, liberals do not believe that there is a certain group of human beings, a certain class that has superior dignity to other groups, and that dignity is something that needs to be protected by a rule of law that limits the ability of states to impinge on the rights of those individuals. And it depends on things like constitutions, checks and balances that, again, are efforts to limit the power of the state. Now, that distinguishes liberalism from something like a theocracy that is based on a single religious doctrine. It's also different from nationalism that takes one ethnic group or race and places that at a higher dignity to other people. Now, liberalism also is compatible with nation states that have limited territorial jurisdiction. We can talk about that later. So the world can be or needs to be divided up into nation states, but within the confines of a nation state, liberalism asserts that citizens should be treated equally. I think that there are basically three arguments that you can make in favor of liberalism. One is a pragmatic one, second is a moral argument, and the third is an economic. So let me just go over those in turn. The pragmatic argument stems from the origin, the historical origin of liberalism. Liberalism appeared in the middle of the 17th century as a result of the European wars of religion. So after the Protestant Reformation, Europeans spent roughly the next 150 years fighting each other. Something like a third of the population of Central Europe died in the course of the 30 Years' War. It was a very bloody conflict, a very cruel one. And I think at the end of that period, a lot of European thinkers decided that they needed to lower the temperature of politics such that politics would not be around a central definition of the good life. There were competing definitions of the good life, and liberal thinkers argued that the state ought to be neutral with regard to them. And that means that the central liberal virtue is toleration. you are going to lower the horizons of politics in order to preserve life itself so that people wouldn't kill each other over the kinds of sectarian differences that had animated European politics in the previous generations. And so it's a means of governing over diversity. The reason you want a liberal society is that societies are diverse religiously, ethnically, racially, in very many ways, and liberalism is a way to allow those different groups to live next to each other peacefully. The moral justification for liberalism really has to do with the protection of human autonomy and the ability of human beings to exercise choice. I think that this ultimately has religious roots. If you go back to the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve are instructed by God not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They disobey God and they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And thereafter, human beings have a kind of intermediate moral status. They're not God, they do not have God's dignity, but they're also different from the rest of nature in the sense that they can sin. And actually the fact that Adam and Eve made the wrong choice is really, in a way, what characterizes the moral core of a human being. Human beings can understand the difference between right and wrong. They can choose to do right. They oftentimes make the wrong choice, but that makes them different from the rest of created nature. And ever since then, I think liberal societies have said that human beings basically want to have that fundamental freedom, who to marry, where to live, what occupation to pursue, what beliefs to hold dear, and that is a moral character that is fundamental to the dignity of human beings, right? If you ask almost any modern person, so people use the word human dignity all the time, and if you ask what constitutes human dignity, what's the ground of it, I would say that it's fundamentally this ability to make moral choices. The final argument really has to do with economics, because among the fundamental rights that liberal regimes protect is the right to own private property, the right to transact, all protected by a rule of law that respects those property rights and protects the ability to transact, to make economic transactions. And if you look historically across different kinds of societies, the richest societies have always been essentially liberal ones that have protected property rights, that have a fundamental rule of law, that create the institutional framework within which a modern market economy can arise. Now, this is true even in a place like China. When China opened up to the world in 1978, it gave up central planning. It began to allow ordinary citizens to, in effect, own private property to keep the results of their labor, and China began to grow. It quadrupled its output in the next 4 years after the Household Responsibility Act was passed that allowed peasants to keep the surplus from their labor. In other words, they introduced incentives into what had been a completely centrally planned system, and that really is the basis for China getting rich. Now, China is in no way a liberal society politically, and it's become a lot less liberal since the rise of Xi Jinping in 2013, but the prosperity of modern China really did depend on their adoption of a liberal understanding of property rights. Without that, they could not have experienced the kind of economic miracle that they did. And this is simply the latest in a whole series of economic success stories, beginning with the Netherlands, Britain, other liberal societies that were the pioneers of the first the commercial and then the industrial revolutions, because it protected the ability to innovate, to earn money. It provided incentives to citizens to enrich themselves, and so it has produced wealthy societies. All right, so those are the basic arguments in favor that I think are still very important and necessary to keep in mind. So the question is, why has liberalism come under attack as it has from both the right and the left? Most of my, well, I wouldn't say most, but a surprising number of my students would not describe themselves as liberals because they feel that liberal societies have permitted too many economic injustices, inequalities, and the like, and that liberal societies are too slow at correcting those. But there's also a critique that comes from the right that is unhappy with the fact that liberalism actually doesn't set a common goal for the whole society, that it tolerates different views of the good, that it is religiously diverse or permits a kind of religious diversity and the like. I would say that the sharpest criticisms are not of what I regard as that core of classical liberalism, right, that assertion of the universal dignity of human beings. It really has to do with what I regard as extensions of liberal ideas into realms where they cease to make sense or they have very counterproductive consequences. And there's a kind of symmetry because these extensions are both on the right and on the left. If we begin with the ones on the right, it has to do with what's now generally referred to as neoliberalism. That is to say, this is not capitalism per se. For some people, neoliberalism is a synonym for capitalism. I think that there's a much more restrictive definition which has to do with the extension of market principles that is associated with economists like Milton Friedman, the Chicago School, Gary Becker, George Stigler. These are people that argued that state intervention was counterproductive, it hurt economic efficiency, and they argued for an across-the-board removal of the state from economic life. We associate this period with politicians like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. Ronald Reagan famously said, the scariest words he's ever heard were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." This began a whole period in at least American cultural, but also I think for many Europeans, cultural history where the state became the big enemy. The state was the enemy of economic growth. It overregulated, it disincentivized creators and entrepreneurs and the like. And I think that the impact of this kind of, we have to be fair about this. It was precisely this kind of neoliberalism taken to a global level that accounted for the quadrupling of global output between, let's say, the early 1970s and the early 2000s, because you created a global trade system which actually worked the way that your trade theory courses say it should. If you have a comparative advantage and you're able to trade, you can expand markets very dramatically and everybody gets rich. And this is really what happened in that period. The problem, of course, was that what the trade theorists tended to underemphasize was that not everybody in your society got rich as a result of this process. And in particular, low-skilled people living in rich societies were likely to lose jobs and opportunities to similarly skilled people in poor countries. And this is exactly what happened, particularly after the entry of China into the WTO in 2001. The other thing was that the whole mantra about taking the state out of the economy was applied in the wrong places, and particularly in the financial sector. The financial sector cannot regulate itself. Markets do not culminate, or they do not end in a kind of self-regulation that protects the interests of the society as a whole. And I think we saw this during the subprime crisis in 2008, when banks were allowed to take excessive risks. But this was just the culmination of a whole series of financial crises that began with the sterling crisis in the early 1990s, then the Asian financial crisis, Argentina, Russia, a whole series of economies blew up because of the excessive movement of liquidity from one part of the world to another. And in a way, the people that had formulated this theory of globalization, neoliberal economists, in the United States were hoist on their own petard when it came home to roost in that financial crisis. And I think, this has been well documented, the rising inequality that has occurred precisely in those countries that adopted these neoliberal policies first has exacerbated the kind of feelings of class conflict and working class people being left behind that in some way is at the root of the rise of populism in the second decade of the 21st century. Now, so that's neoliberalism on the right. There's another, I think, distortion of liberalism on the left that you might label woke liberalism. And I think that when a lot of people criticize liberalism, they're not criticizing classical liberalism as I've defined it, they're criticizing woke liberalism. And there are several aspects to this transformation of the way that the left thought about inequality. So what defines a progressive, somebody on the left, is that you do worry about social economic inequality, and you want to redress that. In the 20th century, that inequality was understood in broad class terms. So, a Marxist believes that the world is fundamentally divided between bourgeoisie and proletariat, and you need to equalize the outcomes by centralizing the means of production and so forth in order to solve that problem. As we got to the end of the 20th century, the sources of inequality came to be redefined in much narrower terms, so that it was no longer the inequality of these big social groups like the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, but it came to center on narrower groups that were defined by race, ethnicity, gender, and then eventually things like sexual orientation. Inequality was seen not so much necessarily as economic inequality, but inequality of dignity, where certain marginalized groups were not respected by the rest of society. I would say that there's also a particular American element of this because of America's racial history, that African Americans had been treated unjustly throughout the history of the country, beginning with slavery, but even after the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, you had the continuation of a racial hierarchy that lasted really up until the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that this then created a kind of focus and a mechanism for subsequent groups seeking social justice to fall into that same category of civil rights that needed to be corrected and use the same techniques, like instead of relying on legislatures, relying on courts in order to achieve those equal outcomes. And so inequality morphed in a way from Marxist class struggle to what we now call identity politics. All right, so I want to make really clear, since I've been involved in arguments over this for the last several years, ever since I wrote a book called Identity, what's wrong with identity politics? And I want to be very clear about something. There's a liberal form of identity politics, and there is an illiberal form of identity politics. I have no problem with the liberal form. Liberal form, I would say, goes something like this. People are treated as members of groups. They are marginalized as members of groups. This was classically the most true with African Americans, who simply on the basis of their skin color did not have equal rights. In a liberal society, if you are part of a group that has been mistreated, you have every right in the world to mobilize on the basis of your common identity that is the source of your mistreatment. You mobilize, you enter the political system, and you make demands on the political system to treat you equally. That was the essence of Martin Luther King's civil rights movement, right? That he got up on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and said, I look forward to the day when little black children will be treated the same as little white children. So that is a plea for a marginalized group that organizes on the basis of an identity category to basically demand equal liberal rights to enter into that same liberal society. What's an illiberal form of identity politics is basically when that identity category becomes essentialized, meaning that it's the most important thing that anyone can know about you, your skin color, your gender, your sexual orientation, and that membership in a group will trump anything that you've accomplished as an individual. That is an illiberal form of identity politics, and that's the part of identity politics that I think becomes very problematic in a liberal society. When you give out jobs, places in universities, promotions, and the like, simply on the basis of those identity categories, then that violates this fundamental liberal principle that we regard we regard people in the society as individuals. We judge them on their individual characteristics, their skills, talents, accumulated abilities, and their natural abilities. And if you treat people simply as members of groups, you're basically violating that underlying premise, and that is illiberal. There's a lot of ways that a lot of forms that this can take in terms of the way that people are treated. I think that there's a big controversy right now over things like cancel culture or woke culture. What I would say in general, and I've argued this in many different forums, is that I guess the big argument that I keep having is how broad and how fundamental is this, because a lot of conservatives would argue that we're living under a woke tyranny where every institution in the society is dominated by these identity categories, and that's if you violate the kind of politically correct attitudes towards those categories, you're going to be canceled. From my point of view, this is just not the America that I experience. I think that, first of all, these identity categories really do apply to a certain relatively narrow set of issues related to civil rights and related to, essentially race, sex, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and the like, and that we continue to enjoy liberal freedoms in almost every other regard. So you can say whatever the hell you want about President Biden or, candidate Donald Trump, and nobody's going to put you in jail. I think that people that think that we are living under a liberal tyranny ought to go live in a country like Russia or China. It is a genuine tyranny where you cannot make political statements that contravene, the accepted ones by the political authorities. And so in that respect, there is I think, a hierarchy and a certain priority in liberal rights in which things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, this ability to speak out on political issues is important. It's being eroded by certain parts of the progressive left, but I don't think that it is a general characteristic of the society as a whole. But that's something that we can argue about. The other thing that has been going on really does have to do with that second characteristic of liberalism that I said is a good thing, which has to do with autonomy. So the original understanding of human autonomy, this is the thing that gave human beings dignity in the eyes of God, really had to do with the ability to make certain basic moral choices. But those moral choices were ones that were determined not by human beings, but by God. Human beings existed in a moral framework that they themselves did not invent. And their moral judgments of them would be made concerning the way that they lived up to these externally imposed rules, and that was the essence, let's say, of Martin Luther's, basic Christian freedom. As time went on over the last couple of centuries, the realm of autonomy has expanded pretty relentlessly, so that by the time you get to a thinker like Friedrich Nietzsche, at the end of the 19th century, he creates this character Zarathustra, who is free because not only does he have the ability to obey the law or not, he can make up the law himself. He can create the moral framework, and this is what leads to what is sometimes labeled expressive individualism, where your individuality extends all the way to your ability to establish the moral rules under which you are living. And obviously, you can't have a society if this is the case. Because what is a society? A society are shared rules that allow collective action, that allow people to live peacefully with one another. And if everybody gets to make up their own rules, that's not going to happen. And this expansion of the realm of autonomy has been growing over time. Some of it is actually abetted by changes in technology. So, for example, if you think about something like gender equality, a division of labor between men and women made sense in a hunter-gatherer society, in an agrarian society, and in many respects in an industrial society, because your ability to do useful work, let's say in an industrial society, depended on upper body strength and your ability to lift really heavy objects, dig ditches, this sort of thing. When you go through the kind of socioeconomic transitions that we have seen, and particularly the transition into a post-industrial society in which a majority of people doing useful work are not out there digging ditches or lifting, big bales of cotton or, steel bars, but sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day, typing things into the computer screen. That is a world in which women naturally have a much larger place in the workforce. And I would say that one of the biggest social changes that took place beginning in about the mid-1960s was the entry of hundreds of millions of women into the workforce across the world, beginning in advanced industrial countries that had already made this transition into post-industrial societies, but now it's really happening universally. And in this case, it is technology that has really allowed women to occupy a superior place in those societies, superior in many respects, because quite frankly, women are better at most jobs than men are at a certain age. If you're a HR manager and you've got, you basically have a service job and you can give it to a man or a woman, they've got, identical IQ scores, you're going to give it to the woman. She's going to be much more reliable, she's not going to take stupid risks, and so forth. And so you have these growing shifts in the nature of gender relations across every society that's undergone this kind of shift. I think that it is wrong to say that this is simply an ideological, ideology was part of it. The growth of feminism, the belief in women's equality was obviously something that complemented this shift in workplaces, but it is also something that's fundamentally created by the technological nature of this new emerging society that we have been living in. And so that's a respect in which autonomy has been abetted by technology. I think the latest frontier in this battle really has to do with human biology, because when you think about something like assertions of gender fluidity that underlies a lot of the transgender activists' agenda, it wouldn't be possible, again, without the kind of medical technologies that supposedly make this possible. And so this is another set of developments that's changed the nature of the perceived nature of what liberalism represents. And I think that one of the unfortunate things is that now there are many people in the world, many people who are illiberal, anti-democratic, authoritarian, who are willing to basically take woke liberalism as a substitute for liberalism itself, right? Liberalism, classical liberalism, is all about political rights, the right of people to equally enter the political marketplace, to speak out, to associate, to mobilize. But if you listen to someone like Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin, it's all about LGBTQ rights. And that is that's a mistake. There is that element in liberalism, but in my view, it is an unjustified extension of the understanding, the fundamental understanding of classical liberalism, and it is used by the enemies of liberalism to undermine the legitimacy of the liberal project as a whole. And that's something to keep in mind the next time you hear, one of these profoundly illiberal authoritarian leaders criticizing liberalism and liberal societies. I remind you that back in 2017, Viktor Orban in Hungary said that he is building an illiberal democracy. And that's in fact what he has done. Liberal democracy is a combination of liberal institutions on the one hand that has to do with the rule of law, constitutional checks and balances, and democracy, meaning free and fair elections on the other. And what a lot of populists like Orban have done is to use the democratic part of the combination liberal democracy to attack the liberal part. And then once you attack the liberal part, you can undermine the democratic part because you can change the rules under which elections occur, which has also happened in Hungary. You can make sure you'll never lose another election by gerrymandering and so forth. And this, again, is not based on a serious critique of classical liberalism. It is based on a critique of a certain kind of woke liberalism. The neoliberalism, by contrast, I think is actually the easiest to reverse because it's simply based on policies. And I think in the United States today, you've already seen a very substantial walking back from neoliberalism, right? In the 1990s, you had the Washington Consensus, this belief by virtually every economist that you needed to deregulate, privatize, reduce tariff barriers, so on and so forth. And today, few people believe it in that extreme form. And if you look at actual policy, we've actually returned, back to the 1950s or 60s. Industrial policy has made a huge comeback under the Biden administration, where the state is being used to promote semiconductors, batteries, a whole lot of strategic technologies, and those are things that can be walked back, I think, simply by changes in policy. It's harder to walk back woke liberalism in the sense that because it's embedded in a certain understanding of rights and autonomy, people are less willing to give it up. But on the other hand, I do think that you already see signs that if you mandate policies that are fundamentally unnatural, they're not going to stick. I will give you one little anecdote in support of this view. There's an Italian journalist named Alexander Stilla who wrote this very nice book called The Sullivanians last year. So the Sullivan Institute was a cult that existed in the Upper West Side of New York City. They had a lot of very well-to-do artists, Jackson Pollock and Stanley Greenberg, the critic, and a lot of very well-educated, very creative people that were sucked into a cult that believed that they were all very much on the left, and they all believed that the fundamental injustice was not the private ownership of property, a la Karl Marx, but the nuclear family, and that unless you destroyed the nuclear family, you couldn't achieve a Marxist egalitarian society. And so the Sullivanians in their Upper West Side hideouts actually tried to do this. They would take children away from their mothers and have them raised by somebody else because they thought that the most evil person in the child's life was going to be the mother, who would become a dictator and set a model for dictatorship, politically later on in life. It's a hard book to read because, the personal cost that this doctrine imposed on the cult members that lived in this cult it was pretty horrendous in terms of wrecked childhoods and very unhappy children, very warped individuals that then came out of this movement. And if you say, well, what happened to it? Wasn't this the cutting edge of individual liberation? Well, at that time, a lot of people believed it was. Today, it doesn't exist because, this idea that somehow parents in the nuclear family are deeply unjust and unnatural is simply not true. And so I think that, you get in a way, a kind of natural evolution back to a form of social relationship that actually makes sense both, for individuals, but also in terms of, the Darwinian underpinnings of, sexual selection and so forth. And I think you're also seeing something of a reaction against certain forms of identity politics. DEI was not controversial 5 years ago. It's hugely controversial on many campuses and in many boardrooms in the United States. And so I don't know what's going to happen in these areas. These are the areas that drive conservatives really crazy. But the one thing I would say is that in a liberal society, because you can make free choices, because you can discuss things and deliberate over appropriate policies, nothing is ever, permanent. And if something really does not make sense, like ripping children out of their mother's arms and having strangers raise them, it's not going to continue. And there is going to be an adjustment. It may take several years for the adjustment to occur, but I do think that there is a self-corrective mechanism that applies to these kinds of social changes. Now, some of them, because they're rooted very deeply in changes in technology, are not going to be reversed. So I think women in the workplace is something that is dictated by the nature of economic production today. And you're not going to see women, going back and simply becoming stay-at-home wives and mothers as in previous generations. So some of these social changes are inevitable, but others of them, I think, are much more voluntary, and the voluntary ones are things that in liberal societies we can discuss. I'm going to end just on the following observation. I see Bill Galston sitting there. This is something that he's argued in the past. I think, I would like to defend liberalism in positive terms, why liberal societies and the kind of freedom and dignity that it accords its members is the most powerful argument. But there's also a very powerful argument which has to do with what's the alternative. And I think that part of the reason that we're seeing the rise of these populist nationalist movements all over the world is that liberalism has been so successful. It's produced, with exceptions, it's produced 70 years of peace and prosperity in North America, in Europe, in Northeast Asia, in societies that have adopted this kind of liberal democracy. And I just think that it's a human characteristic that you begin taking these good times for granted. I actually had a line in my original book, The End of History and the Last Man, where I said, if you can't struggle against injustice, then you're going to struggle against justice, because what people want to do is struggle. They want to have some higher horizon to struggle against, and I think that it's become all too easy for young people to forget that they're living in one of the most prosperous, freest societies with the greatest degree of opportunity. They say, okay, so what else is new? Very nice, I want something more. And that, I think, is one of the sources of, this taking for granted these benefits of liberalism that I just outlined to you. It's taking them for granted that has now led a lot of people, especially young people on both the left and the right, to say, it's not enough. I want more. I want social justice, or I want community. I want a stronger sense of bonds with my fellow citizens. And realistically, if you look at the societies that are based on one of these stronger principles, it doesn't end well. You think about India right now. India was one of the premier liberal societies to emerge after its independence in the 1940s. Right now, the BJP, the Hindu Nationalist Party, and Prime Minister Modi are trying to shift its national identity to one that's based on Hindutva, in a kind of Hindu religious ideology. But there's 200 million Muslims in India, and there's Christians and Parsis and a lot of people that aren't Hindus, and so they're basically left out of the national identity. And that is deeply problematic in a society that has that kind of a history of communal violence based on these kinds of sectarian differences. I don't see how you can run a country like India except on liberal principles. But that's unfortunately the kind of world that we are facing today. So I think with that, let me close and see if you have any comments or questions.
I guess the microphones are gone. Sir, you've written some things recently really thoughtful, I thought, about the decline of our institutions and the loss of trust in institutions. So I'd like you to turn a little specific to the profession that these midshipmen and these cadets are entering. If you look at the measurement by Gallup and Quinnipiac in trust in public institutions,
Yeah, it's terrible.
everything's in the toilet except for all these years the military's been way up here until the last 4 years. And it's taken a precipitous decline. And so that's one measurement. If you look at the struggles we're having with recruiting, maybe that's another indicator that this is no longer an institution that people are anxious to join. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's several causes to that decline of trust. It's interesting because it's pretty much across the board with domestic institutions in the United States, but it's also true of a lot of countries that are, outside the U.S. where you've seen a similar loss in trust. And I think it's due to several factors. The most important one, I actually think, is technology, and the fact that so much of our lives has moved online over the past, well, really since about 2010, 2011. I think that that permits people to live in what one of my colleagues labeled bespoke realities, where you can believe things and you can believe that they are empirically supported, that are completely false. But you are living in a universe where, there are thousands, millions of people that kind of agree on these false premises, right? So, you take vaccine denialism, or, something like half the Republican Party believes that or more than half believes that the 2020 election was stolen. A similar percentage believes that vaccines are more harmful than helpful. And I don't think that this could have existed in a pre-internet world in which certain elite institutions had credibility and the ability to filter that kind of information. Those of us that have been looking at this phenomenon since 2016 have always said that social media, the internet, is one of the sources of this. I always thought it was one of like 6 different things. You had economic inequality, cultural conflicts, demagogic politicians, so forth. I now think that this is actually, of those explanations, probably the dominant one that in my mind is really causing this lack of trust. When the internet was privatized in the 1990s, everybody, including myself, said, great, this is going to democratize information. Anyone can have access to any information they want. Information is power. Therefore, this is going to be profoundly good for democratic societies. And it turned out that, part of that was right. It did democratize information, but, good information is not necessarily democratic. It's not what anyone just thinks of, or wishes for sitting at a computer screen. I mean, there's a whole hierarchy of institutions that we have to add credibility to empirical, factual information. And those have really been undermined by the ability of anyone to say anything they want on the internet, right? So that's one issue. I think that, again, the causality is very hard to distribute fairly because there are multiple causes. Obviously, economic inequality has led to this, the fact that elites have managed to seal themselves off from a lot of the world around them that they helped to create. That causes resentment. There are these cultural issues that are very divisive that in many ways I think are more important than just the pure economic inequalities. But I would say actually that it's that technology factor that in my mind is really central to the drop in trust in existing institutions.
Hello, sir. Midshipman Fourth Class Lee. I had a question kind of in regards to that. So without enforcing censorship or just pulling the plug on the internet, how can we absolve the taking for granted of our modern democracies, as well as trying to mitigate on the spreading of just false information?
Yeah, so that's a really tough question. And the reason it's a tough question is that right now you've got two choices in front of you. Either you can have the big internet platforms do content monitoring. So by the way, I mean, we at Stanford, we've been looking at this a long time. We have a cyber policy center that was created several years ago that has looked at disinformation, content moderation. First of all, you have to moderate content. There is so much garbage on the internet that if the platforms didn't do basic filtering of that information, you'd have, beheadings, gory violence, pornography, just stuff that nobody would want to see. And so they have this basic function of, acting as filters. But the big problem comes in political speech, because there's a really big legitimacy problem with a for-profit private company making basic decisions as to what is and is not acceptable political speech. I don't think they've got the right to do that. On the other hand, you don't want the government to do that either. You don't want the government to set up a bureau that says, this is factually true and, this sort of thing. We came up with a solution. I chaired a Stanford working group on platform scale 3 years ago, where we came up with a concept which I increasingly think is the only solution to this problem, which we called middleware, where basically, so what's the problem with these big platforms like, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it's called now, Google? The problem is really their ability to reach these enormous audiences and to either amplify or silence certain voices, right? That's the fundamental problem. It's not censorship, as a lot of people on the right say, but it is a very powerful political tool that can be used for good or ill. So you don't want the government making those decisions, and you don't want these big private companies to do that. Our view was that the only way you can solve it is by competition, that you basically wanted to create a layer of outsourced content moderation companies where you could specify what kind of content you wanted to hear or see, right? So if you're doing an Amazon search, you could say, I only want to buy American, or you're looking for political news, I want to hear about environment, or I want to hear about the southern border, and you would get a dial on your feed where you could adjust that and hear more or less, more diversity, less diversity. But the important virtue of this is that it would put the user in control of content moderation, so that the user could himself or herself make these basic decisions about what came across, through Facebook or X or whatever. Now, we're actually maybe moving in the direction of something like that, because there's now been this proliferation of platforms. All I think is necessary is to have competition in this space, so you're not reliant on 3 gigantic platforms for your news. And so now you've got Blue Sky, you've got Mastodon, you've got Threads, and there's actually a protocol where if you post something on Threads, it also shows up on Mastodon, and if they join the same consortium, all of these platforms can actually reach much broader audiences. But again, you would be in control of what you saw and what other people saw, and I think that's what's critical. What's critical is to reduce the scale of the content moderation and increase its diversity and hand back control to individual users. And, we got stuck because we didn't see an economic model to make this viable, but maybe it's just, appearing, maybe the market is just providing that itself. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, last one, okay.
Okay. Something struck me. You said at one point that if something doesn't make sense, it's not going to continue, referring to
Well,
illiberal.
if something is deeply unnatural, it's probably not going to continue.
Okay. And in I think an obscure essay to which you already referred and Patrick referred earlier that you wrote long ago, I think you made the claim, or at least suggested that if something makes sense, it's not going to end. That is liberalism. And it seems your belief then as now is that liberalism makes sense. And my question is basically this. Could you make the case, just play devil's advocate for yourself, make the case that it doesn't, and do so maybe in light of the case you made against liberalism long ago, which I think consisted in some part, at least in the essay, in the suggestion that liberalism ends in boredom. You ended the essay by saying boredom, the prospect of centuries of boredom might set history going again. Is that still your view, that boredom is the point of view from which liberalism doesn't make sense? It reduces us to a state of boredom? Or would you update that in light of subsequent events?
Well, as I was trying to explain, I do think liberalism makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just that it doesn't make sense to a lot of people at every moment,
But
in
what's
history.
what's their considered argument?
Well, so as I said, there's an adjustment mechanism that has to happen where you try different, versions of liberalism. So I think that's the experiment that we've been going through in terms of neoliberalism, woke liberalism, and so forth. And I think that there is a way of adjusting if these things really don't seem to be making sense or making people happier, then you're going to try something else. And I think that's one of the virtues of liberalism. I do actually think that the boredom at the end of history is something that is driving a lot of people towards this kind of right-wing populism, because sort of that combined with the fact that you can live in this online fantasy world where you're really completely disconnected with reality, abets this. That, like I said, if you can't struggle against real injustice, you struggle against justice. And I think, a lot of people are falling for that. I mean, in Europe, you have all these right-wingers that saying, we're living under the Brussels tyranny of the horrible European Union. Get real. The European Union is a bunch of bureaucrats that make up these annoying rules, but, you're still living in an incredibly free society, but you want to have an enemy and you want to have something to struggle against, and so you turn this into, the monster that you're dealing with. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it seems to me, based on what you just said, it's not simply boredom that's the problem, but the lack of seriousness of one's life and the lack of self-respect one has, and given that you've got no overarching moral purpose.
So, in the original End of History, I said that thumos, this desire for recognition, is important. There are two types. Isothumia, where you demand equal recognition to other people, but also megalothumia, where you want to be seen as greater, and that those two are in tension, because obviously if I'm recognized as superior, then you're going to be recognized as inferior. And the trick in a liberal society is to neuter the megalothumia and put it into safe channel. I originally thought that Donald Trump would be satisfied just by having all these casinos, and that would take care of his megalothumia. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case. But I think that there is this side of human nature that demands recognition, and in a peaceful, prosperous, boring, liberal society, you don't necessarily get it. And maybe just being a CEO or climbing 10 Himalayan peaks, maybe that's not enough, for some people.
Professor Fukuyama, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on liberalism at the 2024 McCain Conference entitled Liberal Democracy Challenges and Critics. Our last panel of the day will take place in 10 minutes. We'd ask you to get up, stretch your legs, and come on back, and we'll conclude with a look at liberalism and its application to military contexts.